The morning light was still soft over San Diego when Eddie Sanders climbed into the cockpit that would change everything. September 20th, 1942, 9:47 a.m., Naval Air Station, North Island. Sanders settled into the seat of a Japanese fighter, the same type of aircraft that had been slaughtering American pilots since the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor 9 months earlier. His hands rested on controls that had once belonged to a dead man. Flight Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga, 24 years old, when his neck snapped in an Aleutian marsh, his Zero flipping inverted into the soft ground, preserved almost perfectly by the impact. Now Sanders was about to do something no American pilot had ever done before. He was about to fly it. This wasn't just another test flight. This was the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero, serial number 4593, the aircraft that had given Japan absolute dominance in Pacific skies. The fighter that American pilots whispered about in ready rooms with a mixture of respect and dread. Sanders had spent 9 years flying military aircraft, logged more test hours than almost anyone in the Navy. He knew what he was doing. But sitting in that cockpit, painted over in U.S. Navy colors, blue-gray over light gull-gray, American stars on the wings, he must have felt the weight of every pilot who died trying to outmaneuver this machine, because that's exactly what they'd been doing. Dying. And nobody knew how to stop it. The statistics were brutal. In China, the Zero had achieved a 12-to-1 kill ratio. 12 Chinese aircraft destroyed for every Zero lost. On Easter Sunday, 1942, over Colombo, 36 Zeros had faced 60 British fighters and bombers. The British lost 27 aircraft, 15 Hurricanes, 8 Swordfish, 4 Fulmars. The Japanese lost one. American P-39s were being torn apart at altitude. F-2A Buffaloes massacred over the Philippines. Even the F-4F Wildcat, America's frontline carrier fighter, was struggling just to survive encounters with an enemy that could turn tighter, climb faster, and dance through the sky like nothing the United States had ever built. The official tactic for American pilots facing a Zero was simple and devastating. Don't dogfight. Use dive and zoom tactics. Do not try to turn with them. You will lose. But here's the thing about that tactic. It meant abandoning your buddies. It meant leaving bomber formations vulnerable. It meant giving up air superiority to an enemy who used it to sink carriers and strafe entire airfields into burning wreckage. American pilots were dying because nobody understood this aircraft. Nobody had ever touched one, flown one, felt how it moved through the air. Until now. The Zero Sanders was about to test had been pulled from hell itself. Akutan Island in the Aleutians, where Koga had crashed on June 4, 1942, the same day as Midway, though nobody knew that connection mattered yet. It took 3 separate recovery attempts to extract the aircraft from that marsh. First team on July 11th found Koga's body and knew they'd hit gold. Second team on July 12th failed when their ship lost 2 anchors in the recovery attempt. Third team on July 15th finally succeeded with proper heavy equipment and a lot of determination. The Zero was shipped to Seattle aboard the USS St. Mihiel, arrived August 1st, then transported by barge down to San Diego by August 12th. Navy mechanics spent weeks rebuilding it. Damaged vertical stabilizer, bent rudder, crushed wingtips, mangled flaps, shattered canopy, twisted landing gear, damaged propeller. They straightened metal, fabricated replacement parts, improvised where they had to. Sanders would later describe it as 98% original, 2% American ingenuity. He fired up the engine. The 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai. Radial caught with a sound that was almost familiar, but not quite. Similar to American radials, but with a different voice, a different heartbeat. The propeller spun up. Sanders scanned the instruments. Oil pressure looked good. Temperature rising steady. Everything nominal. He taxied toward the runway, and the Zero felt light beneath him, almost delicate, responsive. The controls moved with an ease that immediately told him something important. This aircraft weighed around 5,500 pounds, fully loaded. That was 1,800 pounds lighter than a Wildcat. 1,800 pounds of difference between life and death. Sanders pushed the throttle forward and began his takeoff roll. The Zero leapt off the ground like it was eager to fly. The tail came up almost immediately. The aircraft lifted after an incredibly short run. He pulled the gear up and started climbing, and within seconds he understood why Japanese pilots loved this machine. At low speed, the Zero was absolutely beautiful. The controls felt light, almost feather touch. The stick moved with minimal effort. The aircraft responded to every input like it was reading his mind. He made a few gentle turns, smooth, graceful. He tried a steeper bank. The Zero snapped around with an ease that was almost unsettling. At low speed, nothing in the American inventory could touch this thing. Nothing. Sanders climbed to 5,000 feet and started exploring. He tried stalls. The Zero gave plenty of warning before the brake, then recovered gently, almost politely. He tried spins, clean entry, prompt recovery. Everything about this aircraft at low speed was forgiving, balanced, confidence-inspiring. It was the kind of fighter that made average pilots feel skilled, and skilled pilots feel invincible. He could see exactly why Japanese pilots had dominated for 9 months. If you fought the Zero on its terms, at low speed in a turning dogfight, you were already dead. Then Sanders pushed the throttle forward and accelerated. At 190 knots, the Zero still felt good. Responsive, light, beautiful. He was almost starting to believe the combat reports that claimed this thing could do anything. Then he crossed 200 knots indicated airspeed, and everything changed. Sanders tried to roll the aircraft to the right. The stick moved. The ailerons deflected. But the Zero's response was suddenly sluggish, like he was trying to push the aircraft through thick air. He had to use both hands on the stick to force the roll. The Zero responded, but slowly. There was a lag between what he commanded and what the aircraft did. He tried rolling left. Better, but still not crisp like it had been at lower speeds. There was an asymmetry he could feel through the stick. The Zero wanted to roll left. Rolling right felt like wrestling. He pushed the speed higher. 220 knots, 240, 250. At 250 knots, rolling right became nearly impossible. The ailerons had essentially frozen. Sanders had to use enormous force just to move the stick, and the aircraft barely responded. It felt like trying to maneuver a truck instead of a fighter. This was it. This was the answer American pilots needed. The Zero couldn't roll quickly at high speed, especially not to the right. Any American pilot who understood this could survive. Get the Zero into a high-speed engagement, force it above 200 knots, then roll hard right before the Zero pilot could follow. The Zero couldn't match that maneuver. Its controls would lock up. The American could escape or reverse for a killing shot, while the Zero pilot struggled against controls that had turned to concrete. Sanders kept testing. He pushed the Zero into a steep dive to test negative acceleration. The engine coughed and died. The float-type carburetor couldn't handle negative Gs. Fuel flow interrupted. The engine starved until Sanders pulled back to positive acceleration, and it caught again. That was the second critical weakness. The Zero couldn't follow an American aircraft through a pushover dive. Its engine would quit every single time. Any pilot being chased by a Zero could simply push the nose down hard, subject the Zero to negative acceleration, and watch its engine die while the American fighter's pressure-fed carburetor kept running. Sanders also noted what the Zero didn't have. No armor plate behind the pilot, no bulletproof glass, no self-sealing fuel tanks. A few hits from 50 caliber machine guns would turn this beautiful aircraft into a fireball. The Japanese had sacrificed protection for performance. The Zero was fast and agile because it was light and unarmored. But that meant Zero pilots died easily when American gunners found their mark. Sanders landed after 25 minutes. His hands were shaking slightly when he climbed out of the cockpit. Not from fear, from the realization of what he'd just discovered. He'd flown the most dangerous enemy fighter in the Pacific and found its fatal flaws. He wrote his preliminary report immediately, his handwriting urgent. Ailerons freeze up at speeds above 200 knots. Rolling maneuvers at those speeds are slow and require tremendous force. The aircraft rolls to the left much easier than to the right. Engine cuts out under negative acceleration due to float-type carburetor. Then, Sanders wrote the 3 sentences that would save hundreds of American lives. Go into a vertical power dive, using negative acceleration if possible, to open the range while the Zero's engine is stopped by the acceleration. At about 200 knots, roll hard right before the Zero pilot can get his sights lined up. Those words were radioed to Pacific Fleet units within days. Pilots in combat zones received the briefings almost immediately. Some were skeptical. The Zero had dominated for so long that believing it had exploitable weaknesses felt like wishful thinking. But others were desperate for any advantage and implemented the tactics right away. Marine First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh was one of the first to use Sanders's discoveries in actual combat. August 15, 1943, Solomon Islands Campaign. Walsh was flying an F-4U Corsair over Vella La Vella when he engaged enemy aircraft. He shot down 2 dive bombers and 1 fighter. Then, on August 30th over Kahili, he found himself facing approximately 50 Zeros. 50. Walsh had attended the briefing about the captured Zero. He knew exactly what to do. A Zero locked onto his tail. Walsh immediately threw his Corsair into a split S maneuver. Nose down, inverted, pulling through. The Corsair accelerated rapidly in the dive. Walsh watched his airspeed climb 240 knots, 260. Then, exactly as Sanders had prescribed, Walsh rolled hard right. As he rolled and continued the dive, tracer fire from the Zero streaked past his belly. The Zero pilot was firing but missing because his aircraft couldn't roll right fast enough to track Walsh through the maneuver. Walsh knew from the intelligence briefing that the Zero rolled more slowly to the right than to the left. If he hadn't known which way to roll, he probably would have rolled left instinctively. If he'd done that, the Zero would have turned with him, locked on, and killed him. Walsh shot down 4 Zeros that day before being forced to ditch his damaged Corsair. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions. He later stated flatly that knowing what to do with a Zero on his tail, information that came directly from the captured Zero, saved his life several times. Walsh survived the war with 21 confirmed kills, becoming the 4th-ranking Marine Corps ace. But Sanders wasn't the only pilot to fly the captured Zero. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Trapnell, chief of the Flight Test Section at Naval Air Station Anacostia in Washington, D.C., was brought in for comparative testing in early 1943. Trapnell was considered one of the best test pilots in the Navy. He'd evaluated nearly every aircraft type in the American inventory. The captured Zero was transferred to Anacostia so Trapnell could fly it alongside American fighters in simulated combat. They tested how the Zero compared against the F-4F Wildcat, the F-4U Corsair, the P-38 Lightning, and other American types. The goal was to document exactly what each American aircraft could and couldn't do against a Zero in specific tactical situations. Trapnell confirmed everything Sanders had discovered. The Zero was faster than the Wildcat at most altitudes and had a better climb rate, but it was more vulnerable to damage and far less maneuverable at high speed. The Zero could outclimb American fighters below 15,000 feet. But American fighters with 2-stage superchargers could outperform the Zero above 20,000 feet. The Zero had exceptional range but terrible durability. American pilots needed to stop trying low-speed turning dogfights and instead use high-speed slashing attacks, diving passes, energy tactics that exploited the Zero's high-speed control stiffening. Trapnell's report included specific recommendations for different aircraft types. F-4F Wildcat pilots should never try to turn with a Zero below 250 knots. Instead, use diving attacks from altitude. Fire a quick burst, then extend away in a dive using the Wildcat's superior diving speed. The Zero couldn't follow through a high-speed dive without its controls locking up. F-4U Corsair pilots should use their aircraft's superior speed and high-altitude performance. Stay fast, stay high, use boom and zoom tactics. Never get slow, never get into a turning fight. P-38 pilots should do the same. Speed and altitude were advantages. Use them. Never let a Zero force you into a slow-speed maneuvering fight. The tactical. Intelligence spread throughout. The Pacific Theater, by late 1942 and early 1943, Fighter Squadrons Incorporated. The findings into training. New pilots learned the Zero's weaknesses before they ever saw combat. The impact was immediate and measurable. Before the captured Zero was tested, American fighter-to-fighter kill ratios against Zeros were barely better than 1-to-1. F-4F Wildcats were losing pilots at nearly the same rate they were, shooting down Zeros. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943, after Sanders' tactical recommendations were distributed, Wildcat squadrons that implemented the new tactics saw their kill ratios climb to 5.9-to-1. Nearly 6 Zeros destroyed for every Wildcat lost in air-to-air combat. The improvement wasn't because American aircraft suddenly got better. The Wildcat in February 1943 was the exact same aircraft it had been in June 1942. Same engine, same guns, same performance. The improvement was because American pilots knew how to fight the Zero. They understood its weaknesses. They knew to avoid turning dogfights. They knew to use speed and altitude. They knew to roll hard right above 200 knots. They knew to use negative G maneuvers to kill the Zero's engine. Japanese pilots started noticing the change in American tactics during late 1942. Flight reports from Imperial Japanese Navy units mentioned that American fighters were no longer trying to turn with Zeros. American pilots were using hit-and-run tactics, diving attacks, high-speed passes. Zeros that had previously been able to force Americans into turning fights were now unable to close with enemy aircraft that simply dove away at high speed. Petty Officer First Class Saburo. Sakai was one of Japan's most experienced and deadly pilots. Official Japanese records documented 28 aerial victories for him. He'd been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor. In August 1942, Sakai was badly wounded during the Guadalcanal campaign when he mistook Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers for fighters and got hit by defensive fire from a rear gunner. He spent months recovering from severe head wounds that left him partially blind. When he returned to combat in 1943, he immediately noticed that American tactics had changed. Sakai later wrote that American pilots were no longer making the mistakes they'd made in early 1942. They were no longer trying to dogfight with Zeros. They were using their aircraft's strengths and exploiting the Zeros' weaknesses. Sakai found it increasingly difficult to shoot down American fighters using the tactics that had worked so devastatingly well in the war's first year. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar observations. The Americans had learned something. Japanese intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed American aircraft, but found no significant modifications. American fighters looked the same as they always had. Same engines, same armament. Nothing visible had changed. What the Japanese didn't know was that the change wasn't in the aircraft. The change was in the tactics. The change was knowledge. Knowledge that came from Sanders's test flights in the captured Zero. Knowledge that was impossible for the Japanese to counter because it was invisible. You can't develop tactics against an enemy who knows your aircraft's performance envelope better than you do. By early 1943, American test pilots had flown the Zero more extensively than most Japanese pilots ever would. Sanders and Trapnell had documented every quirk, every limitation, every weakness. That information was in the hands of American combat pilots. Japanese pilots were still flying the Zero the same way they'd always flown it. But the Americans now knew exactly how to counter every move. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was significant. For the first year of the war, Zero pilots had dominated Pacific skies with absolute confidence. They knew they could outmaneuver any American fighter in a turning dogfight. That confidence was unshakable. But by mid-1943, that confidence was eroding. Zeros were being shot down at increasing rates. Experienced pilots were being killed. New replacement pilots were even less prepared to face American fighters that now used tactics specifically designed to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. Commander Masatake Okumiya, an air staff officer aboard carrier Ryujo, the same carrier from which Koga had launched on his final mission, had direct knowledge of the Zero's capabilities and the devastating impact of its capture. He later co-authored a book with Zero designer Jiro Horikoshi in 1956, and his assessment was stark. The capture of Koga's Zero was no less serious than the defeat at Midway and did much to hasten Japan's final defeat. That statement came from someone who understood both the tactical and strategic implications of the Americans, gaining complete knowledge of the Zero's performance characteristics. The captured Zero remained in American hands until February 1945. It was used for training, for tactical development, for engineering study. Hundreds of American pilots flew mock combat against it. Hundreds more attended briefings where they learned its characteristics. The aircraft was eventually destroyed in a ground accident when a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver lost control while taxiing and struck the Zero. Commander Richard Crummelin was at the controls when the Helldiver's propeller sliced the Zero into pieces. By that time, the Zero was no longer the most dangerous aircraft in the Pacific. American fighters had caught up and surpassed it. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered service in August 1943. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero, more heavily armed, far more durable, and could match the Zero's maneuverability at combat speeds while maintaining better high-speed handling. Hellcat pilots used the same tactics Sanders had developed. Boom and zoom, high-speed passes, no turning dog fights. The Hellcat's kill ratio against all Japanese aircraft types was 19-1. The Vought F-4U Corsair also benefited directly from Sanders's work. Corsair pilots knew from their training exactly how the Zero would behave at different speeds and altitudes. They knew when the Zero's controls would stiffen. They knew when to roll right. They knew when to use negative Gs. The Corsair's kill ratio was 11-1. Even the older F-4F Wildcat continued to improve its performance. By the end of the war, the official Wildcat kill ratio had climbed to 6.9-1 according to Naval History and Heritage Command records. 1,327 enemy aircraft destroyed versus 178 aerial losses. The improvement wasn't because the Wildcat became a better aircraft. The improvement was because Wildcat pilots knew how to fight. The impact of Sanders's test flights extended far beyond simple kill ratios. The tactical intelligence derived from the captured Zero fundamentally changed the Pacific Air War. Marine ace William Leonard called the captured Zero a treasure and stated that no other captured machine had ever unlocked so many secrets at a time when the need was so great. Multiple aces credited tactics from the Akutan Zero testing with saving their lives on multiple occasions. Sanders never received public recognition for his test flights during the war. His name didn't appear in press releases. His contribution was classified. The test reports were secret. The tactical recommendations were distributed only to combat units. Sanders continued his career as a naval aviator. He flew combat missions later in the war. He tested other captured enemy aircraft. He trained new pilots. He survived the war and eventually reached the rank of Rear Admiral before retiring. When asked about the Zero test flights years later, he said he was just doing his job. Testing aircraft was what test pilots did. The fact that the aircraft happened to be an enemy fighter that would provide critical tactical intelligence was simply circumstance. Trapnell also never received widespread public recognition for his role in testing the Zero during the war. He went on to become one of the most influential figures in naval aviation history. He co-founded the United States Naval Test Pilot School, along with Commander Sidney Sherby, and with backing from Rear Admiral Apollo Susek. The formal school was approved January 22, 1948, with the first class beginning July 6, 1948. Trapnell was promoted to commander, then captain by May 1943. He was the first Navy pilot to fly a jet aircraft. He shaped the development of carrier aviation for decades. But his work with the captured Zero remained just one of hundreds of test programs he conducted during his distinguished career. Tadayoshi Koga, the Japanese pilot whose Zero was captured, died instantly when his aircraft flipped in the Aleutian marsh. He was 19 years old, born September 10, 1922. His wingmen had circled overhead after the crash, unsure if he was alive or dead. They had orders to destroy any Zero that crashed in enemy territory, but they couldn't bring themselves to strafe the aircraft while Koga might still be alive inside. They left. They reported the crash. They didn't know that decision would give the Americans the intelligence advantage that helped turn the tide of the Pacific Air War. Koga was initially buried in a shallow grave on July 11, 1942, then reburied with a Christian ceremony on July 12. He was exhumed in 1947 by the American Graves Registration Service and reinterred on Adak Island with a marker reading "Unknown Japanese Flyer." His remains were likely among 223 unidentified Japanese remains that were cremated in 1953 and interred at Chidorigafuchi National Cemetery in Tokyo. His family never knew during the war that his aircraft had been captured and flown by American pilots. The Japanese military never officially acknowledged the loss of the Zero until after the war ended. The Akutan Zero, as it came to be called, represented one of the most significant intelligence coups of World War II. It wasn't a secret weapon. It wasn't a code machine. It wasn't a strategic plan. It was just an aircraft. But by flying that aircraft and documenting its weaknesses, Sanders gave American pilots the knowledge they needed to survive and win. That knowledge spread from pilot to pilot, squadron to squadron, across the entire Pacific theater. It changed tactics. It changed training. It changed outcomes. The story demonstrates something fundamental about warfare that's often overlooked. Knowledge is just as important as technology. The Zero didn't change between June 1942 and February 1943. It was the same aircraft with the same capabilities and the same limitations. But American pilots' understanding of how to fight it changed completely. And that change in understanding produced a measurable improvement in combat effectiveness. In any conflict, understanding your opponent's capabilities and limitations is as valuable as superior technology. You can have the best aircraft in the world, but if you use it incorrectly against an opponent who knows its weaknesses, you'll lose. Conversely, you can have an inferior aircraft but still win if you understand exactly how to exploit your opponent's limitations while avoiding engagement in areas where they have advantages. Sanders' test flights in September 1942 gave American pilots that understanding. They learned that the Zero's exceptional low-speed maneuverability came at the cost of high-speed control stiffening. They learned that the Zero's long range came at the cost of vulnerability to damage. They learned that the Zero's lightweight construction came at the cost of structural strength and pilot protection. Every advantage has a corresponding disadvantage. Every design choice involves trade-offs. Sanders documented those trade-offs in meticulous detail, and American combat pilots used that information to stay alive and shoot down the enemy. Small pieces of the Akutan Zero remain in museums today. A fragment sits in the Alaska Aviation Heritage Museum in Anchorage. A few other pieces are in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. The bulk of the aircraft was destroyed when that Helldiver's propeller chopped it up in February 1945, but the impact of that aircraft lives on in the history of naval aviation and in the tactical doctrines that are still taught to fighter pilots today. Fight smart. Know your enemy. Exploit their weaknesses. Avoid their strengths. Use your advantages. Sanders understood that instinctively. He flew the Zero 24 times. He documented everything. He wrote the reports that saved lives. And then he went back to work, testing the next aircraft on the schedule. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through grand strategies or political decisions, but through test pilots who fly enemy aircraft, document what they learn, and make absolutely certain that information reaches the people who need it. Sanders didn't change the design of American fighters. He couldn't, but he changed how American pilots fought. And in the end, that made all the difference.